Hi, Trevor, and hi, everyone, for joining us for our sixth Zoom chill and chat. And today we have Dr. Trevor Owens joining us, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Trevor Owens. I'm the head of digital content management at the Library of Congress, public historian in residence at American University, and lecturer at the University of Maryland in the iSchool. I think that's the most of the things to share. And I'm excited to be here. This seems like a really cool concept. So thank you so much for the invite.
So if you could speak a little bit about your journey to where you are now. I don't know what your degrees are in or how you got to where you are. So just speak a little bit to your educational background and then how you got to where you are now.
Sure. So my first experience with libraries was that when I was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison as an undergrad, I was an orchestra librarian. I played the violin. And so I worked with sheet music collections a bit, sort of as a student worker, making copies of things, putting bowings on things, that sort of stuff. Amazing collection of sheet music at the University of Wisconsin. So I did that, and while I was there, I worked. My undergrad degree is in history and the history of science, and so I did a lot of work with history collections, and specifically my focus there. My undergrad thesis ended up being about children's books about Marie Curie and Albert Einstein, and with that, the University of Wisconsin also has this amazing children's book library collection. And so worked some with the librarians there around the history of children's books, which was really fascinating about scientists. So did that work. And then my wife got a job at PBS. So we moved out to DC. And I was just applying for jobs after having an undergrad degree in the history of science. From that, ended up getting a job at the Center for History and New Media at George Mason University, which was looking for someone to be an evangelist for Zotero, the open source reference management software. And so it was historians making reference management tools, open source software. And so I ended up clicking and connecting with them. And that job ended up being really focused on working a lot with libraries, because those were librarians are the main advocates for reference management, research management tools. And so I got to know a lot of librarians through that. I ended up doing a master's degree in digital history while I was at George Mason University, and then ultimately started a PhD program in educational technology there. So that's what my doctorate's in, is in social science research methods and educational technology. And then took a job at the Library of Congress with the NDIP program focused on digital preservation in 2010. And then I've been with the federal government since then. So it's now, I guess that's 11 years. First at the Library of Congress, then at the Institute for Museum and Library Services as a program officer, and then briefly as acting associate deputy director, which is the most like government sounding job imaginable, for libraries, for discretionary grants. All of that is actually one job title. And so did that for 3 years, and I've been back at the Library of Congress as the head of digital content management now. This is year 4.
You have done a little bit of everything.
Yeah, well, I guess the other thing I should mention is I've been teaching for the public history program at American University since 2011. So it's been a decade of doing that. And teaching for the University of Maryland's iSchool for since 2015. So while I don't have an MLS. I don't have that credential. I have probably taught 30 credits of library school though. So at some point maybe that counts as some kind of honorary something or other. But I'm a huge fan.
You can get
I'm a huge fan of librarians and librarianship and a big advocate for it. Although I accept that I have like this weird history and education background. So there you go.
I think librarianship goes hand in hand with history. I have a coworker who has a BA in history, and he just got his degree in library science. And my background is in early childhood education. I have a master's in child advocacy, and then I had to get the Masters of Information or Library Science in order to be a title librarian. So I think everyone dabbles in a little bit of everything. And I think librarianship pulls from so much that it just makes sense to have such a varied background. Um, so we so we talk a little bit about the journey educationally, like if there was some class that you felt that stood out for you that helped you sort of prepare you. Although you've done a lot of different jobs, so I don't know if there was something that specifically maybe you can speak to that was like, oh, I wish I'd taken this sort of class, or I wish I'd known this sort of thing to participate in, that you felt maybe could have better prepared you for some of the positions that you've held. Although deputy director totally sounds like some FBI show. And I feel like that should just be the title on it.
We got to get them all. It's acting associate deputy director. It gets, the more words in it, the less significant it is, right? The more, like, the longer that is, the more. Although it is, I mean, in X Files, I think the guy that ran, like the guy that Mulder was always getting yelled at by,
Oh,
was an
the
associate
smoking
deputy
gun.
director. But he was in a permanent position. I was acting, and he
Okay.
was at the FBI, and I was at the Institute Museum and Library
I
Services.
was thinking of Criminal Minds because the guy is the deputy director of the.
Yeah, no, it's a very government thing. Deputy
Yeah,
directors, associate deputy directors, you name it.
they like those titles.
But you were saying before I like went on a tangent about X Files. I want to make sure I get your question right.
Just to speak a little bit of what you felt has helped you get to where you are, maybe just something that you're like, oh, this definitely helped me become a better librarian or exceed in this position, or it just gave me a background that I didn't know I needed. I mean, I'm sure you've dealt with so many different aspects of the profession, even though, like, I know you said you're not a titled librarian, but you've dealt in library world.
Yeah, I mean, and so the my doctoral work was in education, specifically, but with a focus on research methods. And I've gotten a ton out of all of the research methods kinds of work that I've done. So whether it's the thing that was really fun about doing a PhD where your specialization is research methods, you sort of get to take them from all the different departments. So survey design from the sociologists, content analysis from the communications department, those sorts of things. And I do think any and everything that folks can do to become better consumers of research and communicators about research methods and things like that is great. That's a classes about evaluation methods also really useful to be able to talk about what eval does and doesn't do, and sort of performance measures, measurement, those kinds of things, all super useful. So those would be things. But I think my biggest observation and recommendation about classes in general has been find the people you want to connect with and learn from more so than even the specific subjects, because the network component of all that is so huge. And so like the person that teaches the class that they're the most passionate about, those are also where you're going to meet the people that are going to be like the cornerstone of your professional network going forward too. And so a lot of the most rewarding things that I've ended up doing have been, and the things I think have paid out the most, were somewhat obscure, and also things that had where it was like a specific person I'd heard really good stuff about and was an advocate for students and those sorts of things.
So your first job, you said you were for music librarian, or was you were that sounds, can you speak a little bit about that? I hadn't heard about that. I think I saw a job posting once about a music librarian, and I was like, what do you do as a music librarian?
Yeah, when I wasn't a real one, I was like a student worker that like pitched in a little, because like I played violin in like the all university orchestra, so it was like the non-majors, like we want to keep people engaged in some way. But yeah, that job was basically to help manage like photocopying materials out of the sheet music collection, getting like bowing straightened out on things, making sure that all the students had the right versions of them, and then there was always like a set of questions about how many copies of things could or should get made for copyright, right? Because like how many copies of the scores do we have? How many copies should we have for violins? But tending to circulate Xeroxes as opposed to the actual sheet music masters they kept hands on. So that was the gist of that. which was fun. It was neat to, and music librarianship is so much more interesting than all of that. Like that was the little bits I got into. But at the Library of Congress where I work, there are some amazing music librarians that do everything with published sheet music all the way through to like special collections work with, one of a kind scores and the papers of composers and performing arts folks and all kinds of stuff like that. Really interesting stuff.
You also spoke a little bit about, I always say around digitization. It's the hard one. So we had, I can't, my brain doesn't work anymore. So I apologize to our previous speaker. He works for the library in DC, and he was telling us about how they have their digital memory library, where they digitize stuff for free for the patrons of their library. Maybe if you could speak a little bit to how we're moving into digitizing everything, maybe in that facet or aspect of it, just briefly.
Sure. Yeah. So Memory Lab, probably from DC Public Library, is that right? Which is an amazing
Yeah.
project and program. And what one of the things that I think I get to, when I was at IMLS, that was one of the projects we were able to fund was some of the Memory Lab work, and they now run it all around the country. It's super cool. But what I love about the way Memory Lab works is it's all about people coming in with like trying to make sure they access their own digital memory. So helping everyday folks get control of their files or those sorts of things, scan things, walk away with copies of them, that kind of stuff. But in terms of digitization, it's huge. It's a huge part. I think interestingly, it's increasingly a huge part of preservation reformatting as well. So if you're talking about AV materials, the only future for those materials is going to tend to be digitization. And so that ends up being a very different body of work than what had been sort of access digitization, expanding access, but we're still doing that in all kinds of areas. And then at the same time, you've got the explosion of born digital content at sort of even more enormous rates. Every year is the year the most photographs have ever been taken. You take recent years in history. If you take like the last 20 years or something like that, it's probably more photographs taken of the entirety of history before that, or even small. It's more extreme than that, but those are like conservative things to throw out. So when you get into all of those different aspects, when you're thinking about management of digital collections into the future, you got all of those things in place. So you have access digitization, expanding access to stuff that's stable, that's going to be fine. You've got preservation reformatting, things like microfilming getting completely replaced by digitization, probably in the next 10 years. And then you've got born digital content, really, an interesting aspect on born digital stuff is most book, like if you get a book, it's actually like a printout of the set of digital files, right? Like the digital, like we have print surrogates of digital everything in almost every area, unless you're talking about handwritten stuff in a notebook.
It's fascinating how much the internet has really like grown from, even like, so I graduated high school in 2001. So even where we were then to where we are now, and that's just a little mind blowing for you to say, like in the last 20 years is the most amount of pictures that have ever been taken. But obviously it makes sense. But when you think about it like that quantifiably, it's just, wow.
Yeah, I mean, another one that I think is worth throwing out is like the Library of Congress. One of the things we're still struggling with is how to even talk about counting the things we have that are digital. So it's a somewhat interesting nuance there. And so one example to give is like the canonical answer, if you go to like the annual report of the Library of Congress of how many items there are, it's a count of analog items in the collection, and that's just what it has been over time. We're working through processes to talk about the digital stuff in a more genuine way, but you're something like 180 million items, 200 million items is like a good round number for like what the analog collections are. And all counting is funky and weird because you're talking about counting manuscripts, all kinds of things that are just complicated to count. But there's 20 billion files in the Library of Congress web archives that have come over the last years, and there's billion with a B, right? So that is like, if each of those counts as an item, then the rest of that is, some of those are the Gutenberg Bible, right? So like, it's not apples and oranges, right? There's like a CSS file and an archive website and the Gutenberg Bible. They're not in the same category. But in terms of extent and quantity and tracking. It's really wild. And it's also, the Internet Archive has, I think, 600 billion files or something like that, right? And just even thinking about what it means to use that stuff, what meaningful access to that is in the future, all those kinds of things are really fundamentally challenging, interesting, exciting.
I have a question. How do you deal with, like, there's so much being added to the internet all the time, so much data, it's always there, like nothing gets deleted. And yet you still run into like 404s all the time when you're trying to research stuff. So how do you guys deal with that?
Sure. So we when we do web archiving work, we use the set of tools that the international web archiving community has developed over time. And what's worth noting in this case too is Matt Kelly is faculty at Rutgers, right? If folks don't know Matt, I don't know. I think I may have that right. He was at Old Dominion University and did a bunch of really cool web archiving stuff, and so he knows a ton about web archiving things. But in any event, the premise for web archiving is to basically save copies of files as they were at a place, at a location on the web, and log that so that you can basically do time travel over time to look at the way. And so if folks have used the Internet Archive, it's the Wayback Machine. It's the same, that technology is one that's used now by basically all the national libraries. And they do web crawling, which is capturing files and objects at a moment in time, and then use tools like the Wayback Machine as playback for them. So you can say, show me what that URL looked like at this date. And then we can sort of reassemble the contents to render the website from that moment in time. And so that's now a technology that's been used pretty widely for 2 decades. And it works great. I mean, though, it's all still selective. So in our case at the Library of Congress, one of the teams within the digital content management section that I sort of support there, they focus specifically on web archiving, and the folks that work on that, they don't pick the websites. They run the tools and processes to archive the web. And instead, the subject matter experts, so like the people from the Folklife Center, people from the music division, the music division has this awesome site collection that's like composers' websites. And so someone who's a subject matter expert is the one who's determining which sites get crawled. And then they're looking at what we get over time to make sure it looks good, because they're the ones who would have that kind of expert judgment. But then folks within our teams are the ones that are making sure that the systems and processes work, that we harvest the files, that we download them, that we get them integrated. And then we also work with catalogers who describe the archived sites. And if you're curious, if you go to the Library of Congress website, there's a drop-down. If you do a search, you can do a drop-down just for archived websites. And there's about 25,000 records of different archived websites there. And so you can see like state.gov, we've been crawling for 20 years, and you can basically explore the archived version of the State Department's website as it was captured over time, probably on a monthly or quarterly basis. That's a great question. It's super weird and funky to like wrap your head around how it all works, but it's really interesting.
I have a question jumping off of that. Once some of those 25,000 websites are archived, are there certain issues that arise with them? What type of troubleshooting does the department have to do? And is there any automatic migration of formats of files that they're made up of, or any other type of maintenance that's needed?
Sure. So the continual struggle has been quality assurance, what counts as like good captures. And it tends to be the case that, like in the case of, if you're digitizing books, like someone will do QA and be like, those scans are bad, do it again, right? Like that's the thing. But like when you archive the web, it's like, if you're like, I don't like what these files look like, go back in time and get what they look like in the past, doesn't work. So you basically like pick what you want to, like you say, okay, we didn't get this kind of stuff, here's how we can improve instructions to get this better in the future, but you don't throw out what you got. And so there are automated methods. There's looking at sort of like a lot of things like HTTP response codes and things like that, or how deep a crawl got. There's a lot of really great techniques that folks on the team are way more in the weeds on. But ways to look at, because if you do get 3 billion files in a year, like you're not going to look at every file, but you can look at like all of the scoping for web archives is built around things like go this many hops deep from the main site or different rules, and you can get sort of logs of how well those crawls went together. But your question about formats is also really interesting too, and the general approach with web archives and our approach across the board is and we have this established as policy. So if you're curious, the Digital Collections Management Compendium is a resource that we've published online, which is basically Library of Congress policy for managing digital collections. And within the Digital Collections Management Compendium, one of our core tenets is that we maintain files in their original formats. Like pretty much more a general, someone has to come up with an excuse for why we wouldn't do that, basically, is the default, so that we don't know exactly. There's some really good reasons for it. So if you get a manuscript collection, it's got some weird WordPerfect files in it or something like that. Historians in the future probably are going to be curious about weird things about Carl Sagan's WordPerfect files or something, right? And so just turning them all into PDFs or something like that, can get you into a lot of trouble. And there's a bunch of things that we might do with those original file formats. But at the same time, we do know, in the case of things like web archives, there's a ton of Flash files in there. They don't really render well anywhere on the web, but a lot of folks are playing around with virtualization and emulation tools. So emulation as a service is this really fascinating open source set of tools that a team in Germany has developed, that Yale is doing a lot of work with right now, and it's got some great grant funding to support, but basically ways to run old versions of computers in your browser so that when you see that cool CD-ROM from 1992 that really can only be experienced as a CD-ROM, you sort of click the link off the catalog record and view it in a emulated old operating environment. And so I think we're going to see more and more of that kind of work, and less attempts to do format laddering where you bulk convert material into other formats, in part because the amount of quality assurance that you really need to do to make sure that the thing, what mattered about that object in its original format persists in its new format is just so extensive that folks are generally not going to do it. The places where you will do it, presumably, are situations with audio recordings and video recordings where someone really didn't care about, someone did an oral history interview and it didn't matter that it was this audio format. It mattered that it was that interview, and someone might listen to it and change it into a different master format or something like that. That is a good question.
One of the things that you said was, I think you called it how many jumps deep into a website when like the crawling is happening. Are there certain agencies within the federal government that are like problem children with like their website design creates issues with like the jumping or other things like that?
Oh, that's so government websites tend to do better than a lot of other websites. The worst website, so the biggest challenge tend to be social media platforms for a lot of crawling, like Instagram. Trying to crawl someone's Instagram account is hard. And then things like Wix sites. Like, I don't know if y'all have seen these, but like, if you've ever made a Wix site, if you make a Wix site, you can appreciate instantly why it would be really hard to web archive, because it's the most you just drag and drop everything anywhere and make it do whatever. And if you look at the source code on it, it's just a nightmare. So another interesting aspect with that is the guidelines that exist for like accessibility of websites tend to also be really good guidelines for archivability of those websites, because if a screen reader can read it really well and get access to all the files, there's a good chance that a web crawler is going to have a good shot at it. But there's all kinds of other weird nuance, like calendar functions on websites tend to create weird traps for web crawlers, because there's like an infinite amount of URLs that they might invent based on like user behavior. Or another good example of a thing that's horrible for web crawling is if you have a system or a platform that's primarily entered into via search, there's not lists of pages that something can procedurally sort of work its way through. Those end up being really hard too. So like if you crawl Google, you just get a page that says Google, right? Like it doesn't have the user queries to enter to get you into the results of the database.
Very interesting. Thank you.
I have another question. Do you have a like really big technical background? I mean, do you have to know how to code everything? It seems like you came from history.
Yeah. So I can like poorly read code. And I've like poorly written some code over time. I would say that the things have changed a lot. So a lot of the folks that when we're hiring people onto our teams, a lot of the folks coming out of library school have some amount of like ability to use Python to do some like basic kind of automating things, or sort of like fire up command line things, don't need a graphic user interface to interact with some of the systems and tools we have. But like the folks that are on our teams are not programmers or engineers, and that's not what we like hire people for. Almost everyone that works in the digital content management section has a library degree, and many of them like took one class about Python once in library school, and that's like the extent, or did like software carpentry and picked up the skills to be able to do the work that they do. So I think with all that said, a lot of the work that I do would be more related to almost like sort of product development and sort of product owner roles in software projects. And so in that case, being able to articulate very detailed like technical requirements and work with developers about kinds of things that might work, if that makes sense. So it's less so and folks in our team do a lot of interfacing to other groups in the Library of Congress that are much less technically sophisticated, and sort of help break down projects or system requirements or things like that, that we then bring back into dialogue with the engineers and database administrators and folks like that that actually run the underlying systems. But yeah, it's if folks are looking for a resource in that vein too, I highly recommend the Programming Historian, which is an open access website that has some really great sort of like soup to nuts tutorials about how to do a bunch of different kinds of, like if you want to get into Python, or if you want to just do things with like data processing and cleaning, different kinds of things like that. Really good tutorials there that are peer reviewed too, which is pretty cool. It's a really neat kind of publication.
Can you repeat the name of that?
Sure, it's called the Programming Historian, and it's fun to. I think they've got 3 or 4 different languages for them too. So they've been working a lot with folks around the world to get Spanish, French, and I think they now have Portuguese versions of some of their guides.
Are the classes that you teach at the universities related to the stuff that you're doing in your work at Library of Congress, or do you feel that the classes are kind of shaped around plans for degrees that haven't shifted much within the past like 5 to 10 years?
Yeah. So for American University, I teach a digital history class that's basically been on the books, but like I get to make it up all the time. So that's and what's interesting with that one is it's for primarily for students in their public history master's program. So it's like a lot of folks that want to work in museums, but a lot of them have gone on to do things with like social media or digital collections for museums. So that one's pretty open-ended in terms of what I can do with it. And the courses I've taught for Maryland, I've taught a few different things that have different functions, but sort of a mix of digital curation courses, which are very much related to some of my work, and specifically digital preservation courses, which my book, The Theory and Craft of Digital Preservation, is effectively like it's like the book I wished I had when I taught that course the first time, that I then did have when I taught the course the second time. And that course is very much built around a lot of the kinds of stuff that we do at work, and is sort of about, in that class, I partner everyone with a small cultural heritage organization to basically have them be consultants about how to do digital preservation planning for their organizations. And that's a really tangible set of skills. If anybody's curious, the website for those classes, for the most part has been dighist.org, dighist.org. And you can actually see a bunch of students' projects that resulted from that. The digital preservation ones are kind of fun because like students did like consulting for like an aviation museum down the road from here in College Park, Maryland. And we're like, well, you don't have any, you digitize a bunch of stuff and they're on this one person's computer, like make a second copy. Like very, like the basics of digital preservation are all like, don't do terrible things or like do, the difference between theory and practice in digital preservation is so fascinating. When you get to small orgs in particular, it's like buy a Dropbox account and upload those files off that one computer, right? Like when you get into that risk mitigation mindset, like there's a ton of very practical and pragmatic things that will make things more long-lived. And the most recent, last fall, I taught a class for UMD that was their like management and leadership course, which was interesting because I've now been in like a manager and a supervisor for a number of years. And so it was fun to look at and think about how to teach that class. Which we ended up making a book out of. So there's an open access book we came out with that's like interviews with different people that are leaders in different libraries and archives organizations. That if you go to my blog, it's like one of the most recent posts. It's like a link to where you can download the whole book. It's an open access book. And my blog is just my name, trevorowens.org.
Michael had a question in the chat. I don't know if he wanted to unmute himself or...
Professor Lesk, you're very quiet. We can't hear what you're saying.
This is about quality versus quantity. The National Digital Newspaper Program has done about 15 to 20 million, similar number of dollars.
You're very muffled. I'm not sure if others can hear him, but I can barely hear.
But I think I see the question in the text too, which is the National Digital Newspaper Program did 15 to 20 million pages, and one guy with a microfilm scanner has done 50 million pages. And a question about balancing quantity and quality, which is a great question. And the Chronicling America, the National Digital Newspaper Program, is it's not directly in my area, but I work closely with colleagues who work on it. And I think one of the things to underscore about, there's quality and quantity as initial questions that are worth noting, but there's also questions about selection and representativeness that are important. So one of the things to note with NDNP is that the way that program works is that the National Endowment for the Humanities gives out grants regionally to organizations in different states. They, as part of those organizations, apply to get the grants, and they, in most cases, put together panels of historians and local experts who actually do selection work about which titles to digitize. And so a lot of the work that happens there is also tied up in that the standards for NDNP are also pretty high in terms of both technical metadata and catalog metadata. So the records that get produced for these are important. There's also sort of long-term sustainability of the collections that's important. So those are all aspects to bring together on that. Similarly, anything else to bring up on that? I guess the other thing to underscore with NDNP that's worth noting is that the National Digital Newspaper Program has provided resources that help build capacity for a lot of state historical societies and universities to actually run their own digitization programs too. So it's not only, the end product is not just scanning things, it's also all of the capacity that's built by those institutions developing programs that have then grown out from there. So a good example in this case is University of North Texas is probably one of the most prolific sort of digitization service providers in the country at this point. And they, a lot of what they've built out over time has been from NDNP funding that they had gotten, but they now actually run their own sort of hub of services within the state providing services to a lot of other small organizations, in many cases at cost or based on leveraging their own internal resources. So I think it's with any of these things, evaluating it's important to look at the full range of things you might measure to evaluate the outcomes of those programs. Because in many cases, it's not just the volume of scans, the quality of those scans, but also the impact on institutions and the quality of records and things like that too. So that would be a thought and an observation. But it's a great question.
I think Jess might have had a question before. I wasn't sure.
Yeah, I do. Thank you, Gladys. So what has been your experience working at the Library of Congress as an institution? It just seems like a fascinating institution to be part of, especially you're in such an innovative department within the Library of Congress and in a leadership role in that innovative department.
Sure. I really love the Library of Congress. I mean, it's a kind of singular and fascinating institution in its own right. In that, like, I think one of the best ways to explain the place to people is that they don't start giving you like years of service awards until 30. Like you get them in interim things before that, but like they don't have like you get recognized when you get to 30. And like I had a staff member when I started. Who like they gave an award to, and I think it was for 35 years. But they had people getting awards for 65 years at that thing. Right. And then this is like people that's how long they worked there, right? That's not how old they are, right? Like there are people that like out of high school showed up, got jobs, worked there for 65 years. And in many cases, those are people who could have retired, like have federal pensions, right? After in the old school federal pension, after basically like 40 years, like you're working for 20% of your salary, because if you left, you'd make 80% of your salary and you don't really get more. But that's the like intensity they bring. It's like both the like passion for the work and the intensity they bring to the work. So it's like it's an interesting mixture of like, it's also, the place is 3,000 or 4,000 staff altogether. So it's pretty much unquestionably the largest library in the world, both in terms of like operations and collections. And so that means that like, there's an array and range of things and subjects, and the amount of like the geography and maps division has a whole bunch of just map librarians, right? Like it's a thing that doesn't get replicated in a lot of other places. So that's awesome and exciting. It's interesting too, in that like if you want to get mad at someone, you can be like, well, we'll have a feud for 30 years or we'll figure this out, right? Like because you're kind of like it's like being on like a spaceship that's on like a lifelong voyage, if that makes sense, right? Like a lot of people just don't leave, and so like it creates different kinds of sort of relationship things to figure out with other colleagues. But the job I ended up with is, I think, what was fun with, I left when the ENDIT program was sort of coming to a conclusion, which was the external facing digital preservation sort of capacity network building program, and came back when there was this attempt this special funding that was put forward to create this new unit. And so it was really fun to be like back in making a new thing happen. And I think that's really a testament to Dr. Carla Hayden as our Librarian of Congress, just as a transformational figure. There's just so much energy and excitement about her. Dr. Billington, who was the previous librarian, did a lot of amazing work, but he was the last remaining Reagan appointee that was in office. Like he had been there, he saw the internet like come onto the scene and was a huge force in that. But there's just a lot of excitement and energy around the vision that Dr. Hayden brings to the work. And that's been really fun to be a part of.
With such an old institution, is it hard to convince people like, hey, we need funding to pay to save this fan fiction online? Like, are people hesitant towards change there?
It's interesting in the case of like fan fiction. So the American Folklife Center has been around since 1976. So it has its own sort of longevity and history, and this idea of like vernacular culture being significant and important in different ways. So there are very different sort of like constituencies within the organization that relate on these different aspects of things. But I do think there's a very serious, the folks that have worked at the Library of Congress for a very long time are also very much appreciate the idea of being sort of a preservation oriented organization. And that's sort of and that there's the idea that the Library of Congress should serve to support libraries across the country and around the world in different ways too. So there's, I think, a very strong commitment to, in some cases, there are things that very senior members of staff will be like, well, if we don't do this, then literally no other organization would. So maybe this is the thing we do because it contributes to the whole setup, but at the same time, trying to make sure that like, we participate as a member and a participant in support of the network of libraries. That's both research libraries, public libraries, state libraries, all those sorts of groups that have their own specific constituencies that they serve to.
Those are really great questions. And just as a way to bring it back and wrap it up, Trevor, you've really like forged a path for yourself through all of your careers. So I was wondering if you could just leave us with a piece of advice for all of us starting, or maybe, obviously the Library of Congress is quite an institution. And I know, there's librarians who dream to work there and stuff, or just any general advice for anyone coming on to, recently graduating, and it's kind of like, unknown and unprecedented times.
Yeah. I think the more everyone can think creatively about careers and things you might do and jobs you might do, the better. The job market is rough, and it's rougher than it was in the past. And one of the pieces of advice, like it's a somewhat narrow piece of advice for people looking at government stuff, but I think it applies in a lot of other contexts, which is like if you go into USA Jobs to do searches for jobs, you can do something that's like, show me librarian jobs, which in the like government universe is 1410 is the like number for librarians. And you could say, show me librarian jobs at the Library of Congress. And so those are jobs that are going to get like an enormous amount of applications, right? But if you say, show me library jobs, but at every federal agency, you're going to see tons more jobs. And the Department of Labor is hiring librarians, and NASA hires librarians, right? Literally every federal agency hires librarians. And so when you're going on a search, being expansive in that way is really important. But then in the other direction, if you can say like what agencies you're interested in. If you say, I want to see every job from the Library of Congress, from Smithsonian, from the National Park Service, from, you name it, you'll see a ton of jobs that don't sound like librarian jobs, but might actually be pretty close. So like program specialist jobs, or there's like miscellaneous, there's all kinds of things. And so like thinking expansively in those cases might generate more leads. And I think that it's really important to be, I think a thing I would stress is that a information science degree is relevant to so many different kinds of jobs and careers in different sorts of organizations and the market is so rough that thinking about very expansively about where your talents and skills might be applied is going to be a useful and important thing to do. And then the other thing that I'd stress is that figuring out ways to celebrate even interim accomplishments, so you get a job interview or something like that. That's a huge accomplishment. That means you're on the right track. You're doing good stuff, right? But like you get or don't get a job, and that's so like hard, right? And that figuring out how to both celebrate those interim accomplishments and build sort of networks of support and care to kind of make it through what's a very hard process. So those would be some observations. The only other one that I would throw out is that it's advice that people love to give and then almost no one wants to take because it's scary, which is find people that have the jobs you're interested in at the organizations you'd like to work at, and send them emails that show that you like looked up their stuff, and say, I'd love to would you be willing to do an informational interview with me about how you got your job, this sort of thing. In many cases, people don't get those people don't get high volume of those sorts of thoughtful emails. The worst case scenario is someone's like mean to you, but that means they're mean, and that's on them. That's not on you. So I do think trying to do those sort of informational interviews to reach out to people and hear from them about what their recommendations are about jobs and things is good. And the last one, I think I already said the last one 3 times, but I'll just do one more. Is the other thing to bear in mind is that every bit of advice that you get, like you gotta meter any advice you get about job searches to some extent based on how far away that person is from having been in the job market looking for jobs too, because there's a lot of it's fundamentally different now than it was a decade ago, and it's fundamentally different a decade ago than it was a decade before that, et cetera, all the way back. And so there are still folks giving kind of like good people find good jobs kinds of or there's always jobs for good people, like things that are actually like actively harmful but were good advice 20 years ago, and being able to like process that. I don't know, my computer just like slid away. I don't know if you kept seeing it. But it was also that was the end of my like screed about attempting to give advice.
No, that was
and it's worth noting that
advice.
The end of my advice was also that you should be somewhat distrustful of how far away from being on the job market I am. So right, like that is its own part of the advice. But there you go.
No, that was really, I hadn't heard that advice about emailing people in positions that you wish you could have later on and just reaching out to them. That's actually really helpful. I'd never heard of it before, but I wanted to thank you for your time. It's been such a great chat. We will post this. I was gonna say, Chris, will tell you more about our posting and all that. And Trevor, if once everyone goes, if you can just give us maybe some contact info we can post, not on the video, but just so we can give it out with the listserv and stuff.
I think it's on your website, right? I mean, it seems like
so I'm TJ Owens on Twitter, and I'm trevor.johnowens@gmail.com for Gmail, but I'll give that info too, so you don't have to like try and remember what I said. And it's also on my website.
I know where to find it because I found your website and sent that out with the email about the event just so people could see who you were. So yeah, I got the details. It's all good. I don't know. I'm going to stop the recording.